Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. In past episodes in this podcast, I've looked at the Crusades, which have the reputation of being among the bloodiest and most horrific periods in history, but I think that they were one of the most unlikely and confusing. How do a few thousand knights manage to march overland for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles across entire realms and kingdoms, and against all reasonable expectation go into the Muslim world, which was infinitely stronger than Christian Europe in the Middle Ages in the 11th century, and win and hold Jerusalem and other city-states for over a century? The Crusades didn't quite have the geopolitical importance that we think of today, but they inspired an incredible historiography of how Europe and later the Middle East understood how the modern world came to be. Even though later events like the Mongol conquest had much more immediate impact on the world, it's the Crusades that still have narrative weight today. From shootings in Christchurch, New Zealand, to Osama bin Laden and ISIS, and white supremacist groups, zealots view the Crusades through a distorted lens, and sometimes a romanticized one, to use the past to explain the present and justifying their own bloody actions. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Dan Jones, author of the new book, The Epic History of the Wars for the Holy Lands. Dan looks at individual journeys of the Crusaders, and not only looks at things from the perspective of popes and kings, but also Arab-Sicilian poets, Byzantine princesses, Sunni scholars, Shi'ite viziers, Mongol chieftains, Mamluk slave soldiers, barefoot friars, and merchants. What he looks into is how the Crusades paved the way for all sorts of interactions across cultures, what was happening in tectonic shifts in society that allowed the Crusades to happen, and what were the lasting effects and led to things like the exploration of Americas, and how Christopher Columbus himself viewed his voyages as a crusading action, interestingly enough. So the Crusades were a very complicated time period that can't really be reduced to a simplistic narrative, but we do our best to unpack what they meant. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Dan Jones. All right, we're going to cover what I think is a very thoroughly researched, but also very thoroughly misunderstood topic, which is the Crusades. And I'm very interested in what your take on it is, because you've looked at some sources that traditionally haven't been used. But what made you want to get into this topic in the first place?
Well, I mean, I've written a lot of books about the Middle Ages. So that's kind of the territory I live in historically, if you like. I'm attracted to big, epic stories. I like going across multiple territories. I like going across multiple generations. I'm interested in the intersection between faith and gold, if let's put it simplistically for now. But I'm also very interested in topics that I feel have some contemporary connection. I mean, I'm always hesitant to use the word relevant. I think it's slightly overused, but certainly that can speak to us today. And I think the Crusades, absolutely fit that bill. If you just think about the number of ways that or number of times you hear the word crusade just in ordinary English vernacular, like you're going to hear that the Democrats are on a crusade to impeach the president, or you're going to hear that the other side is on a crusade against whatever the latest policy goal is. You're going to hear that, but equally, you can hear from Islamist terrorists saying that they're attacking citizens of the Crusader coalition. You're going to hear from white supremacists that, Deus Vult is their watchword if you go on any sort of, white supremacist website or Facebook site or whatever. So I think that, Crusader imagery, Crusader language, Crusader ideas and misrepresentation of Crusader ideas is still a big part of our world today. And so there's kind of connective fibers between the now and the then, and for me that's like the sweet spot of the history I try and dig into.
Right. I'm fascinated by the Crusades if we think about politicization of history, because I don't think there's a historical topic that is brought up as much as them. I lived in Istanbul, Turkey for a number of years, and the narrative that's followed there is that it was this precursor to European colonialism or religious violence. In the West, apologists would follow a line like Rodney Stark, who wrote the book The Case for the Crusades, saying it's a check back against the expansion of the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates. So to follow up on what you just said there, how do you think different groups perceive the Crusades wrongly? And what do you think is the agenda behind perceiving them wrongly?
Well, let's start. Where should we start? Why don't we start with the one that seems most sort of visceral on many levels, and that's the Islamist terrorist misuse of Crusades at the moment. So, mainstay of ISIS propaganda. Okay, personal example: I was in Sri Lanka this Easter when all the bombs went off. I was supposed to be staying in the Shangri-La. I was 24 hours difference between me being there and being blown up by a suicide bomber. The ISIS cell that carried out those attacks in Sri Lanka, killing hundreds of people, maiming hundreds more. Of course, they said we're striking against citizens of the Crusader coalition celebrating their infidel holiday. Now, that lumps onto people like me and my 10-year-old and 7-year-old daughters an ideology of crusading. I've just written a book about the Crusades. I do not consider myself a crusader. But of course, the mainstay of ISIS propaganda is, if you're not with us, you're against us. The entire West still basically have a crusader ideology. They want to destroy Islam. They want to prevent us reestablishing the caliphate. Believe me, Scott, I have no great wish to destroy Islam. I would definitely prefer that ISIS didn't restore the caliphate, but that comes under a different sort of category than am I a crusader or not. Okay, so there's a simple misuse of the crusader ideology in that sense, which is to divide the world in two, to make it binary, to make it zero sum, to say it's either us or them, and that's it. Let's take the alt-right. You go on the Daily Stormer. I do not recommend that you do, but should you happen across it, more fool you. You will see on the masthead a Templar knight waving a sword, Deus vult, God wills it, the cry of the first Crusaders. This is pretty nakedly a use of a specific type of crusader, really the Templar, as a model for people in the West, and particularly white people, and usually white men in the West, in America or in Europe. It's almost saying it's your godly duty to fight against people who are not like you. And this really broadens out the remit of the people that they are impersonating, because the duty, let's say, of the Templars, if that's who you're taking your role model off as a white supremacist, was not to kill loads of people who weren't like them. It was narrowly at first to defend the city of Jerusalem, or narrowly at first, to defend pilgrims around the city of Jerusalem from whomever might attack them. It then broadened out to attacking people who were not Crusaders themselves, who were not Christians, and to fight in Crusader armies. But to broaden that out and to say that this is the sort of, or to imply that this is the duty of all white people living in America, for example, or in Eastern Europe or in Britain today, we have, believe me, we have them where I live as well. It's just specious and wrong and anachronistic and heedlessly and irresponsibly violent. Let's take how else is the Crusades misused? I sort of slightly have a problem. The more I work with this, with the sort of casual slinging about of the word crusade. I read the other day a headline that said Joe Biden is on a crack house crusade. Now, whether he was on a crusade to a crack house or to shut down a crack house is neither here nor there. I didn't read on, but it's the sort of casual slipping into the language of, because it's very easy for the media, it's very easy to use this word crusade. It's just sort of used as a loose term to mean a mission with a sort of belief at the bottom of it. I think the more that it gets overused, misused, and cheapened, the less we actually think about what a crusade really was, what it really implied, and what the lasting legacy of this long period of medieval history has been to our world in terms of setting up a vision of two blocks, almost like Cold War style, in which you have the West and you have Islam, and they're irreconcilable and they must be at odds. It's simply not the case.
Well,
it's like people have been capable of living as neighbors, even in the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. People were more than capable of living as neighbors across the religious divide. It happened. The DNA evidence tells us it happened. The chronicle evidence tells us it happened. The conflict is not the norm. The sort of boring cooperation is the norm. It just doesn't make for very exciting stories.
Exactly. Yeah, Christians and Muslim groups were more than happy to be friends for the sake of convenience and warfare against another group, sometimes against their religious brethren, if it meant expansion and territorial gain. But not to get ahead of ourselves, let's jump into your take and your narrative on the Crusades. So, having to rehash everything from 1095, could you just set the basic facts of the Crusades and then present us with your take on how you make sense of them? Because something you highlighted I thought was interesting was that religion was often secondary to commercial and political considerations. So let's begin with your take. How do you approach the Crusades?
Okay, so let's define the period very simply first. I mean, I think that the easiest place is, where do we start the Crusades? Traditionally, you have this tableau scene, don't you? Urban II in Clermont, November 1095, preaching the First Crusade. People of the fighting West rise up. Fighting people of the West, fighting men of the West. Let's be specific. Rise up. Let's go to Constantinople and help the Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos to fight back against the Turkic warlords invading Asia Minor. Then we go on to Jerusalem and liberate that from Muslim rule. That's the normal tableau scene. I adjust that somewhat to say, I think it's more sensible to follow the Islamic scholars like Ibn al-Athir, who says, this is really a bigger process that begins, Sicily and Spain, and I'm using the modern terms for countries here, for simplicity, all around the Mediterranean from the 1060s, 1070s onwards. You're starting to see more and more specifically religious dimensions to clashes between Christian and Muslim rulers. But be that as it may, the Crusades begin at the end of the 11th century, and the First Crusade is unquestionably preached in 1095 and sets off in 1096. At the other end, it's a little foggier. The Crusader state set up by the First Crusade in the Near East, in modern Greater Syria and Palestine and Israel and Lebanon. Well, they fall 1291, but I prefer to take the story of the medieval Crusades on to 1492 with the completion of the Reconquista and the abandoning of ship, if you like, by the last Islamic ruler of southern Spain, of Al-Andalus. There is a plausible argument that says you can take crusading all the way through to 1798, with Napoleon kicking the Hospitallers off Malta. I sort of feel like, okay, maybe, but that certainly doesn't do as a definition for a very tight book about crusading. Okay, so that's our temporal parameters set. What's my take to answer the second part of your question? I suppose it's somewhat encapsulated by the epigram at the beginning of the book, which is from Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, who says, in those days, men cared as much about furs as they did about their immortal souls. He's talking about the beginnings of warfare in Northern Europe that had sort of religiously charged dimensions. And he's implying that actually there's this interrelation here, isn't there, between the normal acquisitive motivations for warfare, getting stuff or land, to put it crudely and simply, and the sort of the faith-based dimensions, and saying, what were you really fighting for here? Was it possessions? Was it land? Was it territory? Was it waterways? Was it communication networks? Was it women? Was it slaves? Or was it, genuinely faith? This belief, this sort of apocalyptic end of days, millenarian belief in that you're fighting a cosmological battle as well as a real one here on Earth. Well, the story of the Crusades is not about is it one or is it the other. It's about how are these things fitted together at different times in different places, and at what point does one count? At what point does one outweigh the other, and vice versa? So I think that's it's a very fruitful area to explore over a long period, because it has many answers in many places, and that's what makes for sort of subtle and interesting and varied history.
It's a really complicated topic, and I mean, just a very brief historiography that until about the Enlightenment, people took the Crusaders' words at face value for why they went off to fight, to liberate Jerusalem for their faith. Then in the Enlightenment, critics would say that this was the medieval superstitious era exemplified. And there were also a lot of freebooters and